My grandfather told me once about overhearing two men in a smoking room talking about their school days. Well, at our school, said the first, we had a ghost's footmark on the staircase. It was very unconvincing, just the shape of a shoe with a square toe, if I remember right. The staircase was stone. I never heard any reason behind the thing, which seems odd when you come to think about it. Why didn't somebody invent one, I wonder? Oh, you never can tell with boys, said the other. They have a mythology of their own, the folklore of private schools. Well, let's see, replies the first. I wonder if I can remember some of the staple ones I was told. Well, first there was the house with a room in which a series of people insisted on passing the night, and each of them in the morning was found kneeling facing a corner, repeating, I've seen it. And then they died quite mad. Oh, you heard that one. Then, let me think. Oh yes, there was the room where a man was found dead in bed with a horseshoe mark on his forehead, and the floor under the bed was also covered with the marks of horseshoes. I don't know why. Or there was the lady who locked her bedroom door in a strange house and heard a thin voice among the bed curtains saying, Now we're shut in for the night. Well, none of them has any explanation or sequel. I wonder if those stories still do the rounds. Well, I'm sure they do, said the second. But didn't you hear of a real ghost at a private school? Nobody has that I ever came across. I brought it up because a strange thing happened at mine 30 odd years ago, and I haven't any explanation for it. My school was in London, in a large, fairly old house, a great white building with rather fine grounds about it. There were large cedars in the garden and ancient elms in the 3 or 4 fields which we used for games. I think it probably was quite an attractive place, but boys seldom remember their schools as possessing any tolerable features. I came to the school in September, soon after 1870, and among the others who arrived on the same day was a boy who I'll call MacLeod. I needn't spend any time in describing him. He wasn't an exceptional boy in any way, not particularly good at books or games. But the main thing is that I got to know him well and we became friends. The school was a large one. There must have been 120 to 130 boys there as a rule, so a considerable staff of masters was required, and there were rather frequent changes in my room. On perhaps my 3rd or 4th term, a new master made his appearance. His name was Mr. Sampson. He was tallish, stoutish, pale, with a black beard. We liked him. He travelled a good deal and had stories which amused us on the school walks, so there was some competition among us to get within earshot of him. I remember too that he had a charm on his watch chain that he let me look at one day. Yes, I can see it now. He told me he'd picked it up in Constantinople. It was about the size of a florin, or perhaps rather smaller. I suppose in retrospect, it was a gold Byzantine coin. There was an effigy of some emperor on one side, and the other side had been worn practically smooth, and he'd scratched into it, rather barbarously, his own initials, GWS, and a date, 24 July 1865. Well, the first odd thing that happened was this. Mr. Sampson was doing Latin grammar with us. One of his favourite methods, rather a good one I've always thought, was to make us construct sentences out of our own heads to illustrate the rules he was trying to make us learn. Well, I mean, of course, that gives a cocky lad many chances to be impertinent, but Sampson was too good a disciplinarian for us to think of trying that on with him. But on this occasion, he was telling us how to express remembering in Latin. And he told us each to make a sentence bringing in the verb memini, I remember. Well, most of us made up some sentence, father, or he remembers the book, or something equally inane. But the boy I mentioned, MacLeod, seemed to be working up something more elaborate than that. The rest of us wanted to have our sentences passed and get out to break, so I poked him and whispered him to look sharp, but he didn't pay any attention. I looked at his paper and saw he had put nothing down at all. So I jogged him again harder than before and told him he was keeping us all waiting, and that did have some effect. He seemed to wake up, and then very quickly he scribbled about a couple of lines on his paper and showed it up with the rest. Well, since it was the last page to come in, and as Samson had had a good deal to say to all the boys who'd written Memeniscimus Patri Meo and the rest of it, and the clock had struck for break before he got to MacLeod, and he had to wait on his to have his sentence corrected. Well, there was nothing much going on outside when I got out, so I waited for him. He came out of the classroom very slowly when he did arrive, so I guess there'd been some sort of trouble. Well, I said, what did you get? Oh, I don't know, said MacLeod. Nothing much, but I think Samson's rather cross with me. Why, you show him some rot? No fear, he said. I even remember to take a genitive. I wrote, memento puse inter quattro taxos. Well, what made you shut that down? What does it mean? Well, that's the funny part, said MacLeod. I'm not really sure what it does mean. It just came into my head and I corked it down. I know what I think it means because just before I wrote it down I had a sort of picture in my head. I think it means, remember the well among the four, what are those dark sort of trees that have red berries on them? Holly? No. Yews. So what did Samson say? Well, he was jolly odd about it. When he read it, he got up and went to the mantelpiece and stopped there for quite a long time with his back to me without saying anything. And then he said, without turning round, and rather quiet, what do you suppose that means? Well, I told him what I thought, only I couldn't remember the name of the tree, and then he wanted to know why I put it down, so I made up something or other. After that, he left off talking about it and asked me how long I'd been here and where my people lived and things like that, and then he sent me away. But he wasn't looking a bit well. I don't remember either of us saying any more about it. Next day MacLeod took to his bed with a chill or something of the kind, and it was a week or more before he was in school again. And about a month went by without anything else happening. Whether or not Mr. Samson really was startled, as MacLeod had thought, he didn't show it. But there was one other incident of the same kind. We still had to make up examples in school to illustrate the different rules. And one day we were going through some dismal conditional sentences, and we were told to make one expressing a future consequence. Well, we did it right or wrong and showed up our bits of paper, and Samson began looking through them. All at once he got up, made some odd sort of noise in his throat, and rushed out by a door that was just by his desk. Well, we sat there for a moment or two, and then I suppose it was incorrect, but I went up to look at the papers on his desk. Of course, I thought someone must have put down some terrible nonsense or other, and Samson had gone off to report him. But he hadn't taken any of the papers with him when he ran out. The top paper on the desk was written in red ink, which the boys weren't allowed to use, and it wasn't in anyone's hand who was in the class. But we all looked at it, MacLeod and all, and took our dying oaths that it wasn't ours. So I counted the bits of paper, and this I am quite certain. There were 17 pieces of paper on the desk, and 16 boys in the form. Well, I banked the extra paper and kept it, and I still have it. You'll want to know what was written on it. but it was simple enough and harmless enough. Si tu non veneris ad me, ego veniam ad te. Which means, I suppose, if you don't come to me, I'll come to you. Well, I can show you the paper, but there's another odd thing about it. Later that afternoon, I took it out of my locker. Well, I know it was the same sheet because I left rather an inky finger mark on it. But no single trace of writing of any kind is on it. Well, since then I've tried various experiments to see whether invisible ink had been used, but absolutely without result. So, after about half an hour, Mr. Simpson looked in again, said he felt very unwell, and told us class was dismissed. He went rather gingerly to his desk and gave us just one look at the uppermost paper, asked no questions, and left. Well, the next day he was in school again, much as usual, but that night the third and last incident in my story happened. MacLeod and I slept in a dormitory at right angles to the school building, where Mr. Sampson slept on the first floor. There was a very bright full moon, and sometime between 1 or 2 I was waken up by MacLeod shaking me. "Wake up," he said. "Look, there's a burglar getting in through Sampson's window." So I said, "Well, why not call out and wake everybody up?" No, he said. "I'm not sure who it is. Please don't make a row, just come and look." Well, naturally I came in and looked, and naturally there was no one there. I was pretty cross and would have called MacLeod plenty of names, only I couldn't tell why. It seemed to me that there was something wrong. Something that made me very glad I wasn't alone in the dormitory. We were at the window looking out, and I asked him what he'd heard or seen. "I didn't hear anything at all," he said. "But about 5 minutes before I woke you, I just found myself looking out of this window, and there was a man sitting or kneeling on Sampson's windowsill looking in, and I thought he was beckoning." "What sort of a man?" "I don't know," he said, "but I can tell you one thing. He was beastly thin, and he looked as if he was wet all over, and I'm not at all sure that he was alive." The next day Mr. Sampson was gone, not to be found. And I believe no trace of him has ever come to light since. Thinking it over, one of the oddest things about it seems to be the fact that neither MacLeod or I ever mentioned what we'd seen to anybody else, and no questions were asked on the subject. If they had been, I'm inclined to believe that we couldn't have made any answer. We seemed unable to speak about it. So that is the story of the gentleman in the smoking room. But in this case there is a sequel, and so it must be produced. In the latter part of that same year, or the next, my grandfather was staying at a country house in the north of England. Well, one evening his host was rummaging around in a drawer full of odds and ends in the living room, and finally put his hand upon a little box. "Now," he said, "you know about old things." And my grandfather was an antique dealer. "Tell me what this is." My grandfather opened the little box and found in it a thin gold chain with an object attached to it. He glanced at it and then took off his spectacles to examine it a little more closely, and asked what the history of it was. "Well, odd enough," was the answer. "You know that yew thicket in the shrubbery? Well, a year or two back we were cleaning out the old well in the clearing, and what do you suppose we found? My grandfather suddenly felt slightly chilly and asked if they'd found a body. We did better than that. We found two. That was in what was left of the clothes on one of them. A funny business. One body had its arms tight round the other. They must have been down there 30 years or more. Well, it was before we came to this place. We filled up that well sharp enough, I can tell you. Without much difficulty, my grandfather had identified the object as a Byzantine gold coin, roughly inscribed on one side with GWS, 24 July.